In the far reaches of 3231, where diplomacy is often written in blood and alliances sealed with lives, one man accepted an alien servant to save Terra Prime. What he didn't know, she was royalty in exile, watching humanity from behind violet eyes. What he couldn't know, his kindness would ignite rebellion, and their bond would reshape the galaxy. Human agrees to alien cultural exchange envoy as payment only to find out she was a wealthy princess. Kale Darren stood with his back, rigid jaw clenched as the Elysiari ambassador's words hung in the air between them. The sterile stellar negotiations chamber aboard the diplomatic vessel suddenly felt suffocating. "I'm sorry, but I must have misheard you," Kyle said, fighting to keep his voice even. "You're offering a person as payment, Ambassador Jarvex." Four eyes blinked in unison, the copper-flecked irises reflecting the harsh overhead lighting, not a person. "Ambassador Harlow, a integration envoy assigned envoy unit. The distinction is important in our culture." Kale's hand tightened around the datapad containing the treaty terms Terra Prime needed this alliance. The Arcturus mining rights alone would solve the resource crisis that had plagued humanity for decades. Director Arden Solas's orders had been explicit. "Secure this treaty by any means necessary." Ambassador Jarvek, "My government does not condone slavery in any form. Surely there must be an alternative arrangement." The ambassador's secondary arms folded across his chest. A gesture Kyle had learned indicated finality. "Our treasury has been depleted by the Nexus conflict. We have nothing else of equivalent value to offer. Without this payment, the treaty holds no weight by our laws." The door at the far end of the stellar negotiations chamber slid open with a mechanical hiss. Two Elysiari guards entered, flanking a slender figure between them. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't human. That much was clear from her lavender skin that seemed to shimmer under the lights. Long, iridescent hair the color of twilight cascaded down her back. But it was her eyes that held him dark violet with flecks of silver, regarding him with a calm intensity that belied her circumstances. "This is Nira Varel, Ambassador Jarvek announced. She has been trained in the ways of service. She will fulfill any need you might have." Kale felt a surge of revulsion at the implication, "I don't want a cultural exchange envoy." "Then consider her a cultural attaché." Jarvek replied smoothly, "But the transfer of ownership must be completed for our treaty to be valid." Kale locked eyes with the alien woman. Something in her gaze, a flicker of intelligence, perhaps defiance, made him wonder what her story truly was. She stood silent, hands clasped before her, dressed in a simple gray diplomatic weave attire that somehow enhanced rather than diminished her exotic beauty. "I need to consult my superiors," Kyle said, turning away from those unsettling eyes. "There is no time," Jarvek countered. "The treaty must be signed before our delegation departs." "This is not a negotiable point." Ambassador Harlow Kale activated his comm link. "Director Arden Solis." "We have a situation," Arden Solis's voice crackled through. "What's the holdup, Harlow?" "The Arcturus Council is breathing down my neck." "Sir, they're offering a cultural exchange envoy as payment, a living person." A brief pause. "And this violates the humanitarian clause." "Exactly, sir." Another pause longer this time. "Find a compromise." "Harlow, that's an order." The connection cut. Kale turned back to face the Elysiari ambassador and the woman who stood as still as a statue. The enormity of what he was about to do weighed on him. "I'll accept the payment," he said finally, "but with conditions on Terra Prime, she will be registered as my employee, not assigned envoy unit. She will have freedom of movement and basic rights under Terra Prime law." The ambassador's mouth twisted into what passed for a smile among his kind. "Call it what you will. The transfer requires only your thumbprint." Kale approached Nira Varel slowly. Up close, he could see faint markings along her temples, intricate patterns that disappeared into her hairline. "I'm sorry about this," he murmured. "I'll make sure you're treated well." For the first time, she spoke her voice like liquid silver. "Your apology is unnecessary." Ambassador Harlow. Her accent was slight but musical, and again, Kale had the distinct impression there was more to this woman than a simple integration envoy. He pressed his thumb against the quantum biometric encoder, feeling as if he'd just made a deal with the devil. "The treaty is complete," Ambassador Jarvek announced with satisfaction. "Naira Varel is in this accord era yours." The guard stepped away from her, and Kale fought the urge to put himself between them and her. Instead, he nodded curtly to the ambassador. "If you'll excuse us, I need to show my new employee to her quarters." Kyle led her from the stellar negotiations chamber, painfully aware of every step she took behind him. The corridor was mercifully empty as they made their way toward the human section of the diplomatic vessel. "I don't believe in ownership of sentient beings," he said without looking back at her. "Whatever they told you about your duties, forget it. You're under my protection, not my command." "That is unexpected," she replied carefully. Kale stopped at the door to his quarters and turned to face her. "Look, I don't know how you ended up in this situation, but while you're with me, you're free." "Understand?" Naira Varel studied him with those unnerving eyes, her head tilting slightly. "Freedom is a concept with many interpretations." "Ambassador Kale," he corrected. "If we're going to maintain this charade, we might as well be on a first-name basis." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "As you wish." The door slid open, and he gestured for her to enter. "First, these will be your quarters. I'll take the adjacent diplomatic suite." She stepped inside, her movements fluid and graceful. As the door closed behind them, shutting out the rest of the universe, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed irrevocably, and that this mysterious woman was far more than she appeared to be. Kale woke to the sound of movement in the outer room of his quarters. For a moment, disorientation gripped him before the events of the previous day came flooding back. The treaty, the payment, Naira Varel. He pulled on a shirt and stepped through the doorway to find her arranging breakfast on the small table near the viewport. The stars streaked by as the diplomatic vessel made its way back to Terra Prime. "Good morning, Kale," she said without turning. "I have prepared a meal according to the nutritional guidelines in your system." Kyle paused, taking in the scene. "You didn't have to do that. It is my function to serve." Her voice was neutral, but when she finally faced him, those violet eyes held something unreadable. "No, it's not." Kale sat down at the table, gesturing for her to join him. "I meant what I said yesterday. You're not my integration envoy." Naira Varel remained standing, her posture perfect. "Your cultural sensitivity is noted but unnecessary. I am accustomed to my role." Kale pushed the second chair out with his foot. "Sit down, please." After a moment's hesitation, she lowered herself into the chair. With fluid grace, Kale noticed how she positioned herself back, straight, hands folded in her lap, eyes downcast at the picture of deference. "Where are you from, Naira Varel? I mean, originally before." He trailed off, unsure how to delicately reference her enslavement. "I was born in the Elisiari outer colonies," she replied smoothly. "My family served the royal household." Kale took a bite of the food she'd prepared, something like eggs, but with a faint sweetness he couldn't place. It was surprisingly good. "And how did you end up as payment in a diplomatic transaction?" A flicker of something caution perhaps crossed her face. "My circumstances changed. The details are unimportant." Kyle frowned. "They're important to me." Naira Varel met his gaze, then her expression calculating. "Why? Because I want to understand who you are, not what they told me you are." The calm unit on the wall chimed, saving her from responding. Kale sighed and activated it. Harlow Director Ardon Solis's voice filled the room. "Report to my office immediately. Bring your diplomatic acquisition." Kale glanced at Naira Varel, who had returned to her perfect posture, eyes carefully blank. "Yes, sir. We'll be there shortly." As the calm unit went silent, Kale pushed his plate away. "I need to warn you, my superiors will have questions. They won't understand this arrangement. I am familiar with human discomfort regarding ownership customs." Naira Varel said, rising to clear the dishes. "I will present no complications." Kyle caught her wrist gently. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. Her skin was warmer than a human's, with a faint vibration beneath the surface like a hummingbird's pulse. "You're not a complication," he said. "You're a person caught in a bad situation. I'll make sure they understand that." Naira Varel looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back to his face. For a moment, her mask slipped, and he glimpsed something vulnerable beneath. "Your kindness is unexpected," she said softly. Kale released her, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "It's not kindness, it's basic decency." "Perhaps among humans," she replied, "but decency is not universal." 20 minutes later, they stood before Director Ardon Solis's door. Kale had lent Naira Varel one of his civilian jackets to wear over her diplomatic weave attire, hoping it might help her blend in. Instead, it only emphasized her otherworldliness, the lavender skin of her neck stark against the dark fabric. "Let me do the talking," Kyle said. Ardon Solis was a career military man with a diplomat's title, pragmatic, ambitious, and unflinchingly loyal to Terra Prime's interests. He looked up from his desk as they entered, his calculating gaze sweeping over Naira Varel. "So, this is our payment," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Quite a departure from the mineral rights we were expecting." Kale stepped slightly forward. "Sir, I want to clarify that while the Elysiaris may view this as a transfer of assigned envoy unit, I've made it clear that on Terra Prime, Naira Varel will be treated as a free citizen." Ardon Solis's eyebrow rose. "Noble sentiment, Harlow, but legally complex. The treaty explicitly lists her as an asset." "An asset I'm responsible for?" Kale countered, "which means her treatment is at my discretion." Naira Varel watched the exchange with sharp attention, her eyes darting between the two men. "And what exactly do you plan to do with her?" Ardon Solis asked. Before Kale could respond, Naira Varel spoke. "If I may, Commander, I am trained in multiple diplomatic protocols, including 17 distinct cultural etiquette systems. I am fluent in 12 languages, including 3 Elysiari dialects. Not in your translation matrices. I could serve as a cultural liaison." Ardon Solis's expression shifted from dismissive to speculative. "Is that so?" Kale looked at her in surprise. This was the most she'd spoken since they'd met, and her knowledge was far beyond what he'd expect from an integration envoy. The Elysiari delegation arrives in 2 lunar cycles for the Resource Allocation Summit. Ardon Solis mused. "Their cultural protocols are notoriously complex. I am intimately familiar with them," Naira Varel confirmed. Ardon Solis nodded slowly. "Very well, Harlow, she's assigned to you. Use her knowledge to our advantage." He turned his attention back to his screens, a clear dismissal. As they left the office, Kale glanced at Naira Varel. "You didn't mention those skills before." "You didn't ask?" she replied simply. Kale stopped in the corridor, studying her. "There's a lot more to you than you're letting on, isn't there?" Naira Varel met his gaze steadily. "There is more to everyone than what appears on the surface. Ambassador Harlow." For the first time since this bizarre arrangement began, Kale smiled. "Fair enough. Let's go see about getting you some clothes of your own." The Terra Prime embassy on Illyria Station gleamed like a crystal palace, its architecture a deliberate showcase of human ingenuity. Kale tugged at his formal uniform collar as he surveyed the gathering of diplomats and officials from a dozen worlds. "Remember," he murmured to Naira Varel, "you're my cultural attaché, not my integration envoy." Naira Varel stood beside him, transformed. Gone was the simple gray diplomatic weave attire, replaced by an elegant gown of deep blue that complemented her lavender skin. Her hair was styled in an intricate pattern that Kyle suspected held cultural significance he couldn't decipher. "I understand my role," she replied, her voice low. "The Elysiari ambassador is approaching from your left. He will expect you to bow slightly but maintain eye contact, a sign of respect without submission." Kale followed her guidance, executing the greeting perfectly. The ambassador's secondary arms relaxed, a sign of approval Kale wouldn't have recognized without Naira Varel's coaching. As the evening progressed, Kale found himself increasingly reliant on Naira Varel's whispered instructions. She navigated the complex web of alien protocols with effortless grace, steering him away from potential diplomatic incidents with subtle touches to his arm or back. "How do you know all this?" he asked during a rare, quiet moment. Naira Virel's eyes tracked the movement of various diplomats with practiced precision observation study necessity. Before Kyle could press further, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A group of Elysiari officials had arrived, their ornate uniforms marking them as military elite. One of them froze upon seeing Naira Virel, his 4 eyes widening in what Kale interpreted as shock. "Is something wrong?" Kale asked her. "No," she answered too quickly, "but we should avoid that group." Too late, the Elysiari officer was already approaching, his gaze fixed on Naira Virel, with an intensity that made Kale instinctively step closer to her. "You," the officer said in Elysiari, not bothering with the translator. "How dare you show your face?" Kale understood enough to recognize the hostility. "Is there a problem, officer?" The Elysiari switched to accented English. "This cultural exchange envoy is stolen assigned envoy unit. She belongs to the royal household. She was transferred to me legally as part of a diplomatic agreement." Kale countered, keeping his voice level. The officer's upper lip curled, a mistake that will be rectified. He reached for Naira Virel's arm. Kale intercepted, gripping the officer's wrist. "Touch her and you'll create a diplomatic incident." The tension between them drew attention. Director Ardon Solis materialized at Kyle's side, his presence a calculated intervention. "Perhaps we should discuss this in private," Ardon Solis suggested smoothly. The Elysiari officer withdrew, but his parting glare promised trouble. As the gathering resumed its normal rhythm, Kale noticed Victor Reeves, a fellow diplomat, watching Naira Virel with undisguised interest. "Your new assistant is quite exotic," Reeves commented, sidling up to them. "I'd be interested in negotiating a transfer of her contract." Kale's jaw tightened. "She's not for sale or transfer. Everything has a price." Reeves insisted, his eyes never leaving Naira Virel. "Not everything," Kale replied coldly. "Not everyone." Later, as they returned to their quarters, Kale noticed Naira Virel's unusual silence. "You handled that well," she finally said as the door closed behind them. "Most humans would have surrendered me to avoid conflict." Kale faced her, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "I'm not most humans." Naira Virel's eyes searched his face. "No," she agreed softly, "you are not." In the dim light of their quarters, with the memory of his protection still fresh, something shifted between them, a boundary beginning to blur, a connection neither had anticipated starting to form. The attack came without warning. 3 shadowy figures burst into Kale's quarters while he reviewed treaty documents. He barely had time to register the Elysiari stealth suits before the first attacker was upon him. Kale's military training kicked in. He blocked the first blow, twisting to avoid a stun baton. The second attacker circled behind him, looking for an opening. "Naira Virel, run!" Kyle shouted, hoping she'd fled to safety. A blur of movement caught his peripheral vision. Naira Virel launched herself at the third attacker with a precision that spoke of extensive combat training. Her movements were fluid, practiced. Nothing like the subservient woman he'd been presented with. She disabled her opponent with a complex joint lock that Kyle recognized as advanced Elysiari military technique, not something an integration envoy would know. Working together, they subdued the attackers. As the last one fell unconscious, Kale stared at Naira. Virel breathing heavily. "You want to explain how an integration envoy knows elite military combat moves," he demanded. Naira Virel's composed facade cracked. She straightened her posture, changing subtly, shoulders back, chin lifted. The transformation was remarkable. Suddenly, she radiated authority. "We should secure them before they regain consciousness," she said. Avoiding his question, Kale stepped forward, blocking her path. "No more evasions. Who are you really?" Their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Naira Virel sighed. "My name is Princess Naira Virel Relian, first daughter of the Elysiari royal house," she admitted. The woman you think you purchased never existed." Kale stepped back as if struck a princess playing cultural exchange envoy. "Why? To evaluate humanity," she replied calmly. "My father believes humans are too unpredictable, too dangerous to join the galactic concord. I volunteered to assess your species firsthand. By getting yourself traded as a signed envoy unit." Kael's voice rose in disbelief. "It was the most direct way to observe human behavior without pretense," Nira Virel explained. "How you treated someone you believed powerless would reveal your true character." Kale ran a hand through his hair, processing this revelation. "So this whole thing, the treaty, the payment, it was all a test? The treaty is genuine," she assured him, "but my role was multifaceted. Those attackers, they knew who you were." Nira Virel nodded. "My brother Vexier opposes alliance with humans. He likely sent them to retrieve me and sabotage the treaty." Kale's mind raced with implications. Does Arden Solis know? No one on Terra Prime knows my true identity? She said that was essential to the validity of the test. Kale felt anger rising within him. "So, I've been part of some elaborate experiment, a lab rat being studied. At first, yes, Nira Virel admitted, but things have evolved. How Kale demanded Nira Virel stepped closer, her expression softening. "You were kind when you had no reason to be respectful, when you could have been cruel. That was unexpected." Kale's anger warred with a growing understanding. "And that matters to you." "More than I anticipated," she confessed quietly. The air between them charged with unspoken tension, the culmination of days spent in close proximity of boundaries crossed and secrets revealed. Security alarms blared, breaking the moment Kyle activated his neurocom node. "Harlow here, what's happening?" Director Arden Solis's voice crackled through. "The Elysiari delegation is demanding the return of their stolen assigned envoy unit. They're threatening to withdraw from the treaty." Kale looked at Nira Virel, understanding dawning. "Sir, there's something you need to know about my diplomatic acquisition." The safe house on Luna was sparse but secure, tucked away in the shadow of Armstrong Ridge. Kale paced the small living area while Nira Virel sat perfectly still, watching him process everything. "So your entire royal council is evaluating humanity based on how I've treated you," Kale summarized. "No pressure there, not just you." Nira Virel corrected, "But yes, you have become a significant data point." Kyle stopped pacing. "A data point is that all this has been." Nira Virel stood moving toward him with that fluid grace that in this Accord era read as regal rather than submissive. It began that way, and in this Accord era, Kale challenged. "Now I find myself compromised," she admitted. "My objectivity is impaired." Kyle closed the distance between them. "Why, you know why," she whispered. The tension that had been building between them since that first meeting crackled like electricity. Kyle reached out his fingers, brushing her cheek. Nira Virel leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "This complicates things," he murmured. Considerably, she agreed. Their first kiss was tentative, exploratory, the meeting of two worlds, two entirely different species. Her lips were warmer than he expected. That same humming energy he'd felt when touching her wrist in this Accord era coursing between them. When they separated, Kale saw vulnerability in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "The royal observer compromised by a human," she said with a small smile. "My father would be appalled? And you?" Kyle asked. "I am reconsidering many things," she admitted. A chime from the communication console interrupted them. Director Arden Solis's face appeared on the screen. "Harlow, we've got a situation. A Elysiari Imperial sky cruiser just entered orbit. They're demanding Princess Nira Virel's immediate return." Kale tensed, who's leading the delegation. "Prince Dravek Relian." Arden Solis replied, "Claims to be her brother." Nira Virel's expression hardened. "Dravek, I should have known." After Arden Solis signed off, Kale turned to her. "What aren't you telling me?" "Dravek opposes alliance with Terra Prime," she explained. "He believes humans are too primitive, too emotionally volatile to join the Concord." "And what do you believe?" Nira Virel met his gaze steadily. I believe my brother is wrong. Humanity's emotional depth isn't weakness, it's strength. You feel deeply, love, fiercely protect what you value. These are not flaws. Kale took her hands in his. Then stand with me. Tell your brother, your people, what you've learned. It's not that simple, she said. If I fail to return, it could trigger a diplomatic crisis, and if you do return, Dravek will ensure my report is buried, she said. He has wanted the throne since childhood. A commotion outside interrupted them. Through the window, Kyle spotted Royal Elisiari guards approaching. We're out of time, he said grimly. Nira Virel squared her shoulders once again, every inch the royal princess. Then let us face this together. As the door burst open, Kale and Nira Virel stood side by side, hands clasped human and Elisiari united against whatever came next. Prince Dravek Relian was the mirror opposite of his sister. His skin a deeper purple, his movements sharp and precise where hers were fluid. 4 royal guards flanked him as he entered the safe house. Sister, he said, his tone silky with false concern. What indignities you've suffered for your research. Nira Virel's posture remained regal. No indignities, brother. Ambassador Harlow has been the embodiment of human honor. Dravek's eyes flicked dismissively to Kyle. How fortunate! Nevertheless, your experiment is concluded. The Imperial Sky Cruiser awaits. I haven't completed my evaluation. Nira Virel countered. Oh, but you have, Dravek produced a data crystal. The Council has reviewed preliminary findings and deemed humans unprepared for Concord membership. Kale stepped forward on what grounds aggression, emotional instability, technological immaturity. Dravek's secondary arms gesticulated in a Elisiari gesture of dismissal. The Council votes at the next Stellar Summit, Princess Nira. Virel's presence is required. Nira Virel's eyes narrowed. Those aren't my findings. They are the correct findings. Dravek replied coldly. Findings that will ensure humanity remains where it belongs, isolated and contained. Kale felt a chill at the implications. Contained. What exactly does that mean? Dravek smiled, revealing pointed teeth. The Concord protects developing species, sometimes from themselves. You're planning to quarantine. Terra Prime. Nira Virel realized horror dawning on her face. A small fleet has already been positioned, Dravek confirmed. At the next Stellar Summit's vote, Terra Prime will be designated a protected development zone. No interstellar travel permitted. Kale's mind raced. That's not protection. It's imprisonment. Semantics. Dravek dismissed. Now, sister, come willingly, or my guards will assist you. Nira Virel stepped between Kale and her brother. Humans are ready, Dravek. They've proven their worth. My report will reflect that. Your report is irrelevant. Dravek snapped. The decision is made. Not yet, Nira Virel challenged. Not until the council votes, Dravek's patience evaporated. Guards, secure the princess. As the guards moved forward, Kyle reached for his sidearm. Nira Virel grabbed his arm. No, she said urgently. If you resist, it proves his point about human aggression. Their eyes met in a moment of perfect understanding. Kale lowered his weapon. I'll come voluntarily, Nira Virel announced to her brother, but Ambassador Harlow accompanies me as Terra Prime's representative. Dravek's expression darkened unacceptable. It is my right as mission leader to include relevant witnesses, Nira Virel countered. Unless you wish to explain to the council why you violated royal protocol. A tense standoff ensued, brother and sister locked in silent combat. Finally, Dravek relented. The human may accompany us, he conceded, but he remains in custody during transit. As they were escorted to the Imperial Sky Cruiser, Kyle leaned close to Nira Virel. He won't let me speak to the council. No, she agreed quietly, but getting you aboard the Imperial Sky Cruiser is step 1 and step 2. Nira Virel's lips curved in a subtle smile, proving that humans excel at the unexpected. The Imperial Sky Cruiser's detention cell was luxurious by prison standards, but a cell nonetheless. Kale tested the energy barrier for the third time, receiving another painful shock for his efforts. The door slid open, revealing not a guard, but Lisa Reen Kett, Nyra Varel's handmaiden. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before deactivating the barrier. "Princess Nyra Varel sent me," she whispered. "We have little time." Kale followed her through service corridors, avoiding the main passageways. "Where's Nyra Varel?" In her command suite, supposedly preparing for the council presentation, Lisa Reen explained, "Prince Dravek has altered her report. She's creating a secure copy of her original findings." They reached a junction where Nyra Varel waited in this Accord era, dressed in a form-fitting Zerelian Class Phi grav suit. She pressed a similar suit into Kale's hands. "Change quickly," she instructed, "we're leaving." Leaving, Kale questioned as he pulled on the suit in the middle of space. "There's a diplomatic shuttle in the secondary bay," Nyra Varel explained. "If we can reach it, we can return to Terra Prime before the council votes." Kale zipped up the suit, "And if we're caught, then my brother proves his point about human unpredictability," she said with a grim smile. They moved through the vessel like shadows, Lisa Reen leading them through service routes known only to royal attendants. At one junction, voices approached Nyra. Varel pulled Kale into a narrow alcove, their bodies pressed together in the confined space. Kyle became acutely aware of her proximity, the warmth of her skin through the thin Class Vi grav suit. Nyra Varel's eyes met his, her breath quickening. "When this is over," he whispered, "we need to talk about what's happening between us." "If we survive," she murmured back. "We will," he promised. The voices passed. They continued their journey, finally reaching the shuttle bay. As Lisa Reen worked to override the security protocols, Kale noticed Nyra Varel studying him. What he asked. "I'm trying to understand," she said softly, "how you've become so important to me in such a short time." Before Kale could respond, the bay door slid open. They rushed inside, only to find Prince Dravek waiting with 2 guards. "Predictable," he sneered. "Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate this?" Nyra Varel stepped forward. "Brother, please, you're making a mistake. Humans deserve a chance. They deserve nothing," Dravek spat. "They're barely more than animals." "That's where you're wrong," Nyra Varel countered. "I've seen their art, their compassion, their courage. They feel more deeply than we do. That's not weakness, it's their strength." Dravek's laugh was cold. "Listen to yourself, sister. You've been contaminated by their primitive emotionalism." "No," she replied steadily. "I've been awakened by it." Kyle watched the exchange, sensing the deeper currents beneath their words. Centuries of Elysiari cultural evolution that had driven them away from emotional expression, valuing logic above all else. "Guards," Dravek ordered, "take them both to secure holding." In that moment, Kale made a decision. He stepped forward, hands raised. "Prince Dravek, I challenge you to Talaran right." The guards froze. Nyra Varel's eyes widened in shock. Dravek stared at Kale. "How does a human know of Talaran right?" "I've been studying your culture," Kyle replied. "I know it's a royal challenge that cannot be refused." "Kale, no." Nyra Varel whispered urgently. "Talaran right is a fight to submission. Dravek is a trained warrior." "So am I," Kyle replied, never taking his eyes off Dravek. The prince's expression shifted from surprise to cruel amusement. "Very well, human Talaran right. It is. When I win, you will be executed for your presumption. And when I win," Kyle countered, "you will allow Princess Nyra Varel to present her true findings to the council." Dravek's secondary arms flexed in anticipation. "Agreed." As the guards moved to prepare the ritual space, Nyra Varel gripped Kale's arm. Why, she demanded, why risk everything? Kale covered her hand with his, because some things are worth fighting for. The Talaran Right Arena was a circular platform suspended above a ceremonial pool. Kale stood opposite Prince Dravek, both stripped to the waist according to tradition. A small audience had gathered royal guards, crew members, and Nyra Varel, her face a mask of controlled fear. Elysiari combat was unlike anything Kale had trained for. Dravek's forearms moved in complex patterns, his secondary limbs often acting independently of his primary ones. Kale absorbed several punishing blows before adapting his strategy. "You fight well," Dravek acknowledged, circling him for a human. "Kale tasted blood and you fight predictably for a prince." The taunt landed. Dravek's attack pattern changed, becoming more aggressive and more reckless. Kale exploited the opening, landing a solid blow to Dravek's midsection. The fight continued, both combatants bloodied and breathing heavily. Kale's human endurance began to tell against Elisiari's strength. He weathered Dravek's increasingly desperate attacks, waiting for the moment to strike. It came when Dravek overextended. Kyle swept the prince's legs, sending him crashing to the platform. Before Dravek could recover, Kyle pinned him, arm across his throat. "Yield," Kyle demanded. Dravek struggled his secondary arms, clawing at Kale's back. Never to a human, Kale increased the pressure. "Your pride isn't worth your life, yield." For a moment, it seemed Dravek would choose death over surrender. Then, with a hiss of defeat, he tapped the platform 3 times. The ritual submission, Kyle released him and stood, offering a hand to the fallen prince. Dravek ignored it, rising on his own. "The human wins," announced the ritual observer. "The terms of Herentor are binding." Dravek's eyes burned with hatred. "You've won nothing. The council will never listen to a human's testimony. They will listen to mine." Nyra Varel stepped forward, and in this Accord era, because of Ambassador Harlow, they will hear the truth. The council chamber was ancient, its walls inscribed with the history of Elisiari diplomatic relations. 12 elders sat in a semicircle, their aged faces grave as Nyra Varel presented her findings. "Humans possess qualities the Concord desperately needs," she argued passionately. "Creativity, adaptability, emotional intelligence. Yes, they are young as a spacefaring species, but their potential is limitless." Matriarch Zarina, oldest of the council, leaned forward. "Yet your brother presents evidence of their violent tendencies. Evidence carefully selected to support his position." Nyra Varel countered. "I have lived among them. I have seen their capacity for growth, for compassion." "The princess has been compromised," Dravek interjected. "Her judgment is clouded by emotional attachment. Is it?" Nyra Varel challenged, "or have I simply experienced what you refused to see?" She turned to the council. "I ask you to judge not just humanity, but the merits of our own evolution. Have we advanced by suppressing emotion? Or have we lost something vital?" Kale stood silent, understanding that this debate was as much about Elisiari culture as it was about humanity's fate. Matriarch Zarina's ancient eyes settled on him. "Human, you have fought for the right to be heard speak." Kale stepped forward. "I won't pretend humans are perfect. We're not. We're messy, emotional, sometimes irrational, but those same qualities drive us to create, to explore, to connect. We seek understanding across differences. We learn from our mistakes." He paused. "Princess Nyra Varel came to study us. Instead, she helped me understand something about both our species, that true strength comes not from perfection, but from how we face our imperfections." A long silence followed. Finally, Matriarch Zarina spoke. "The council will deliberate. Until then, the quarantine fleet will stand down." As they left the chamber, Kyle felt Nyra Varel's hand slip into his small gesture, but in that moment it bridged 2 worlds. Terra Prime's diplomatic headquarters hummed with tension. Kale stood before the Joint Chiefs and Director Arden Sales, his formal uniform uncomfortable after weeks in Elisiari attire. "Let me get this straight," General Hayes said incredulously. "You challenged an alien prince to ritual combat over a princess who was pretending to be a cultural exchange envoy." "That's a simplified version," Sir Kale admitted. Arden Sales pinched the bridge of his nose. "And in this Accord era, the fate of Terra Prime's relationship with the Galactic Concord hinges on their council's decision." "Yes, sir." The room erupted in overlapping questions and accusations. Kale weathered them all, his mind partially distracted by thoughts of Nyra Varel. They'd been separated upon return to Terra Prime, she to the Elisiari embassy, he to military debriefing Ambassador Harlow Arden Solace, cut through the noise. Did you at any point consider the broader implications of your personal relationship with Princess Nira Virel? Kale met his superior's gaze. With respect, sir, that relationship is what gave Terra Prime a fighting chance. The princess could have submitted a negative report. Instead, she risked everything to present the truth. General Hayes leaned forward. And what is the truth, Ambassador? That humanity is ready for the stars, Kael replied simply, and that the Elysiaris need us as much as we need them. Across the city in the Elysiari embassy, Nira Virel faced her own tribunal. Her father, High Sovereign Relian, had arrived personally to oversee the proceedings. You defied your brother, the Emperor stated, championed humans against your own people's safety. Nira Virel stood tall. I championed truth against prejudice. Father, humans are not what we believed. So your report claims, the Emperor replied skeptically. Yet Vexir Thalos presents compelling evidence of their volatility. Evidence carefully selected to support his views, Nira Virel countered. I lived among them. I saw their capacity for growth, for compassion. And for violence, the Emperor noted, Ambassador Harlow defeated your brother in combat. A combat Vexir initiated Nira. Virel corrected, and when Kael won, he showed mercy. Something Vexir would not have done. The Emperor's 4 eyes narrowed. You use his given name, you've grown attached to this human. Nira Virel met her father's gaze without flinching. I have, and that attachment has shown me what our people have lost in our pursuit of perfect logic. Before the Emperor could respond, a royal messenger entered, bowing deeply. Your Majesty, the Council has reached its decision. The Terra Prime delegation and Elysiari royal family gathered in the grand audience chamber. Kael found himself standing mere feet from Nira Virel, yet unable to speak with her. Their eyes met briefly, conveying volumes in a single glance. Matriarch Zarina, speaking for the council, addressed the assembly. After thorough deliberation, the council has voted to offer Terra Prime provisional membership in the Galactic Concord. A murmur ran through the human delegation. Kyle felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Furthermore, Zarina continued, we recognize that this outcome was made possible through the actions of Princess Nira Virel Relian and Ambassador Kael Darren. Their unique relationship has demonstrated the potential for meaningful alliance between our peoples. Kael couldn't help but smile at the diplomatic understatement. However, Zarina's tone grew serious. Vexir Thalos has raised valid concerns about potential instability. Therefore, we propose a solution that addresses both perspectives. The ancient matriarch turned to the Emperor. With your Majesty's approval, we recommend Princess Nira Virel be appointed as permanent ambassador to Terra Prime, with Ambassador Harlow as her human counterpart. Together, they will oversee the integration of Terra Prime into the Concord. The Emperor considered for a long moment, his gaze shifting between his daughter and Kael. I approve, he finally declared. Princess Nira Virel will represent the Elysiari Empire on Terra Prime. As the assembly dispersed into celebratory groups, Kyle finally reached Nira Virel's side ambassador. He said, formally aware of the eyes upon them. Ambassador, she replied, her lips curved in a subtle smile. I believe we have much to discuss regarding our new assignment, Kyle suggested. Nira Virel's eyes sparkled with promise. Indeed, we do. 1 year later, the Terra Prime Elysiari Cultural Exchange Center opened its doors. Kael watched from the podium as humans and Elysiaris mingled in the grand atrium, a sight unimaginable just months earlier. Quite a change from when I was considered your assigned envoy unit, Nira Virel murmured beside him. Kyle smiled. I think we've both come a long way from that first meeting. Their partnership had evolved into something unprecedented, a bridge between species, cultures, worlds. Together, they had navigated the complex integration of Terra Prime into the wider galactic community. The Emperor arrives at the next stellar summit. Nira Virel reminded him, my brother will be accompanying him. Kyle raised an eyebrow. Should I be concerned? Dravik has accepted reality, if not embraced it, she replied. Father made it clear that further opposition would be unwise. Their personal relationship had developed alongside their professional, one breaking barriers and establishing precedents. What began as an arrangement of convenience had blossomed into something neither could have predicted. "Your quarters are prepared for the delegation," Kale said, "though I was hoping you might not use them." Nira Varel's lips curved in a smile. "Ambassador Harlow, are you suggesting something improper?" "Merely continued cultural exchange," he replied innocently. Their banter was interrupted by Director Ardon Solis in this Accord era, Terra Prime's representative to the Concord Council. Ambassadors, he greeted them. "The President has approved your proposal for the exchange program. 50 humans will begin training on Illyria in 2 lunar cycles." "Excellent news," Nira Varel replied. "The Royal Academy is eager to receive them." As Ardon Solis moved on, Kyle took Nira Varel's hand discreetly. Speaking of proposals, her eyes widened slightly. "Kyle, I've been studying Elysian bonding traditions," he said quietly, "and human ones too. I think we could create something new, something that honors both worlds." Nira Varel's expression softened. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I am." Kale confirmed. "It won't be easy. We'll be the first." "We've been the first in many things," she interrupted gently. "Why stop in this Accord era?" Their ceremony, held 3 months later, blended traditions from both worlds. The Emperor himself presided a political statement as much as a personal blessing. Vexir Thalos attended his former hostility, tempered to cool acceptance. As they exchanged vows, Kale and carefully practiced Elysian Nira Virel in perfect English both understood the significance beyond their personal union. They were setting a precedent, opening a door for others to follow. 2 worlds, 1 future, Kyle said as they completed the ritual binding. Nira Virel's eyes shimmered with emotion. Her people had long suppressed a future neither of us could have imagined when you accepted an unwanted payment. "The best diplomatic decision I ever made," Kale replied, drawing her close as they sealed their union with a kiss that bridged species and cultures. Applause erupted from the gathered witnesses, human and Elysian alike. In that moment, the distance between worlds seemed to vanish, replaced by the promise of a shared destiny. Later, as they watched Terra Prime rise over the lunar landscape from their private command suite, Nira Varel rested her head against Kale's shoulder. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what would have happened if you'd refused to accept me as payment?" Kale considered the question. "I think we would have found each other anyway." "How can you be so certain?" "Because some connections transcend circumstance," he replied, drawing her closer. "Some debts are worth more than what they cost." Nira Varel smiled, understanding the deeper truth in his words. What had begun as a diplomatic debt had become something far more valuable, a bridge between worlds, a foundation for peace, and a love that defied all conventional boundaries. In the soft lunar light, human and Elysian embraced their union, a living testament to the unexpected ways in which the universe brings souls together across distances, across differences, across the stars themselves.